On the morning of May 4, 2015, life seemed completely ordinary inside a quiet mobile home community just outside Melbourne, Florida. The elderly man living there had spent years blending into the neighborhood. Most people knew him simply as Bill Cox, a retired truck driver who enjoyed country music, occasionally played his guitar on the porch, and rarely caused any trouble. At 79 years old, arthritis had slowed his movements. His hair had turned white, and he appeared to be like countless other retirees, enjoying a peaceful life after decades of hard work. His neighbors had no reason to suspect that the friendly old man they waved to every morning had been carrying one of America's oldest secrets for more than half a century. That morning, two people knocked on his front door, claiming to be insurance representatives. They explained that they needed a few signatures to complete some paperwork. Nothing about the encounter seemed unusual. Bill welcomed them, assuming it was just another routine visit. As he signed the documents, investigators quietly obtained his fingerprints. Within hours, those prints were compared to records that had been sitting inside Ohio archives since the late 1950s. Results confirmed what United States Marshals had suspected for months. Bill Cox did not exist. Standing in front of them was Frank Freshwaters, a man who had escaped prison in 1959 and successfully vanished for 56 years. When deputies returned to arrest him, there was no chase, no resistance, and no dramatic final stand. The elderly fugitive simply looked at an old photograph of himself that investigators had brought and reportedly remarked that he had not seen that picture in a very long time.
Approached him, showed him the 1959 picture, asked him if he'd seen that person, and he said he hadn't seen him in a long time.
After more than half a century spent looking over his shoulder, the past had finally caught up with him. News of the arrest spread quickly across the country, but it was one detail that immediately captured the public's imagination. Frank Freshwaters had once been incarcerated inside the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, the massive Gothic prison that millions of movie fans recognized as Shawshank State Penitentiary from the beloved 1994 film The Shawshank Redemption. Almost overnight, newspapers began referring to him as the Shawshank Fugitive. While the movie itself was entirely fictional and not based on Freshwaters' life, the connection was impossible to ignore. Long before cameras transformed the prison into one of cinema's most iconic locations, Frank Freshwaters had lived behind those same towering stone walls. He had walked the same corridors later used by actors Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, looked through the same barred windows, and experienced the same oppressive atmosphere that gave The Shawshank Redemption its unforgettable sense of isolation. The similarities, however, only went so far. Andy Dufresne escaped through years of careful planning, slowly carving a tunnel with a tiny rock hammer before crawling through hundreds of yards of sewage to earn his freedom. Frank Freshwaters' escape was far less cinematic. He did not tunnel through a wall or outsmart corrupt prison officials with an elaborate scheme. Instead, he simply walked away from a lower security prison farm. Yet despite its simplicity, his escape led to something arguably even more remarkable than Hollywood fiction. He remained free for 56 years, building an entirely new identity, raising a family, working honest jobs, and living an outwardly respectable life, while one of the oldest warrants in Ohio quietly waited for him. His story became less about the escape itself and more about the extraordinary life that followed. To understand how an ordinary young man became America's longest-running prison fugitive and why his story remains forever connected to the Shawshank Redemption, we have to travel back to Akron, Ohio, nearly 6 decades before that quiet knock on the door changed everything. Frank Freshwaters was born on April 18, 1936, in Akron, Ohio, a city that had become the heart of America's rubber industry. During the middle of the 20th century, Akron was booming. Companies such as Goodyear, Firestone, and B.F. Goodrich employed thousands of workers, drawing families from across the country in search of stable employment and a better future. Like many young men growing up in the city, Frank came from a working-class background where long hours, personal responsibility, and providing for one's family were considered fundamental values. There was little in his early life to suggest he would one day become one of the country's most famous fugitives. By the mid-1950s, America was experiencing unprecedented optimism. World War II had ended a decade earlier. Suburbs were expanding rapidly, and millions of young families believed they were living through the beginning of a new American dream. Frank appeared to be following that same path. He married young, found steady employment, and seemed to be building the kind of ordinary life that countless Americans hoped for during that era. Friends and acquaintances later described him as neither violent nor reckless by nature. He was simply another young husband trying to establish himself in post-war America. Everything changed on the night of July 3, 1957, as communities across Ohio prepared for the 4th of July celebrations. 24-year-old Army veteran Eugene Flint was making his way home. Flint had already served his country and had built a family of his own. He was married and the father of 3 young children who expected him to return home that evening just as he always had. Instead, his life would end in a tragedy that forever altered 2 families. According to investigators, Frank Freshwaters was driving at an excessive speed when his vehicle struck Flint. The collision proved fatal. Eugene Flint lost his life, his wife became a widow, and 3 children were left without their father. For Frank Freshwaters, the accident instantly transformed him from an ordinary young man into someone facing the full weight of the criminal justice system. Freshwaters accepted responsibility for what had happened and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. Initially, the court showed remarkable leniency. Rather than imposing a lengthy prison sentence, the judge suspended his incarceration and placed him on probation for 5 years. It represented a second chance, an opportunity to prove that the fatal collision had been an isolated mistake rather than evidence of a fundamentally criminal character. Had he successfully completed probation, his life might have followed an entirely different course. That second chance, however, did not last. Within the following years, Freshwaters violated the conditions of his probation. Although historical records provide limited details regarding the specific violations, they were serious enough for the court to revoke its earlier decision. In February 1959, the suspended sentence disappeared, replaced by a prison term of up to 20 years at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield. At the time, the prison was already known for its imposing Gothic architecture and strict disciplinary environment. Built in the late 19th century, its towering stone walls, narrow cell blocks, and cathedral-like administration building gave it an appearance more reminiscent of a medieval castle than a correctional institution. For inmates arriving through its gates, the prison represented far more than a place of confinement. It was designed to remind them every day that society had closed its doors on them. Decades later, filmmakers would choose the same location to portray Shawshank State Penitentiary, recognizing that few prisons in America possessed such a haunting visual presence. When Frank Freshwaters entered those gates in 1959, he could not have imagined that the prison would one day become one of the most recognizable filming locations in movie history. Nor could he have known that generations of audiences would later associate those same walls with the fictional story of Andy Dufresne. Although the circumstances surrounding the 2 men were dramatically different, Andy was an innocent banker wrongly convicted of murder, while Freshwaters had admitted responsibility for a fatal act of reckless driving. Both men began journeys that would forever be defined by imprisonment, hope, and the relentless desire to reclaim their freedom. When Frank Freshwaters arrived at the Ohio State Reformatory in early 1959, he entered one of the most intimidating prisons in America. Rising above the town of Mansfield, Ohio, the prison looked less like a correctional institution and more like an enormous European castle. Massive limestone walls stretched toward the sky, Gothic towers overlooked the grounds, and narrow windows allowed only small amounts of light to enter the aging structure. For first-time inmates, the prison's appearance alone was enough to inspire fear. It was intentionally designed that way. Built in the late 19th century, the Ohio State Reformatory was meant not only to imprison men, but also to remind them every day that they had been separated from the rest of society. Inside, life followed a strict routine. Long before sunrise, inmates were awakened by guards making their rounds through the cell blocks. Meals were eaten quickly, conversations were limited, and every movement throughout the day was controlled by whistles, orders, and locked gates. Although the institution had originally been created to reform younger offenders, overcrowding and decades of hard use had transformed it into a harsh environment where violence, intimidation, and corruption were constant realities. Unlike Andy Dufresne, however, Freshwaters was not entering prison while proclaiming his innocence. He had pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and understood that his own actions had placed him behind bars. That distinction is important because it shaped how each man approached prison life. Andy spent years fighting against a punishment he believed he never deserved. Freshwaters, on the other hand, appears to have accepted that he needed to serve his sentence. Rather than challenging authority or causing trouble, he quickly developed a reputation as a cooperative inmate who followed orders and stayed out of conflicts. That approach proved to be one of the most important decisions of his life. Many prisons operate on a classification system that rewards inmates who consistently demonstrate good behavior. Those who obey rules, avoid violence, and show responsibility can gradually earn privileges unavailable to the general prison population. During the late 1950s, the Ohio prison system followed a similar philosophy, and Frank Freshwaters soon became one of the inmates who benefited from it. Freshwaters was transferred from the Ohio State Reformatory to the Sandusky Honor Farm in Perkins Township, a minimum security prison camp where carefully selected inmates performed agricultural work. Unlike the towering walls and steel bars of the Mansfield prison, the Honor Farm operated under an entirely different philosophy. Prisoners worked outdoors, maintained farmland, cared for equipment, and were trusted with responsibilities that would have been unimaginable inside a maximum security institution. Security existed, but it depended largely on the honesty of the inmates themselves rather than constant armed supervision. Ironically, this aspect of Frank Freshwaters' story mirrors one of the central themes of the Shawshank Redemption. Andy Dufresne gradually transformed himself from just another inmate into someone whose intelligence made him valuable to the prison administration. After helping Captain Byron Hadley avoid paying taxes on an inheritance, Andy earned the respect of several officers and eventually became indispensable to Warden Samuel Norton. He handled financial records, expanded the prison library, and gained privileges unavailable to most prisoners. His usefulness provided him with opportunities that others never received. Although the circumstances were entirely different, Freshwaters experienced something remarkably similar. He did not possess Andy's financial expertise, but he demonstrated reliability. In both stories, prison officials lowered their guard because they believed they understood the men under their supervision. Andy carefully cultivated that trust as part of an elaborate escape plan that would take nearly 2 decades to complete. Freshwaters simply became the kind of inmate authorities believed would never run. The Honor Farm was quiet compared to the Ohio State Reformatory. Gone were the endless rows of iron cells and the echoing sounds of gates slamming shut. Instead, inmates spent much of their day outdoors, performing agricultural labor under limited supervision. The freedom he had earned through good behavior had created the very conditions that made an escape imaginable. Whether he began planning immediately or whether the idea slowly developed over time remains unknown. Freshwaters rarely spoke publicly about his decision, and many details disappeared with him. What is certain is that somewhere during those months on the honor farm, he made a life-changing choice. Rather than completing his sentence and eventually earning his release through legal means, he decided he would reclaim his freedom on his own terms. On September 30th, 1959, that decision became reality. Late that afternoon, at approximately 5 o'clock, Freshwaters and another inmate quietly left the Sandusky Honor Farm. By the time prison officials realized the two prisoners were missing, they had already disappeared. Compared to Hollywood, the escape seems almost anticlimactic. Audiences remember Andy Dufresne spending nearly 20 years chiseling through a prison wall, using nothing more than a tiny rock hammer hidden inside a Bible. They remember the famous Rita Hayworth poster concealing the growing tunnel, the thunderstorm masking the sounds of escape, and Andy emerging from a sewage pipe into the rain with his arms raised toward the sky. It remains one of the most iconic scenes in film history because every moment feels earned after watching the character endure almost 2 decades of injustice. Frank Freshwaters' escape could not have been more different. There was no elaborate master plan, no hidden tunnel, and no symbolic moment of rebirth beneath a thunderstorm. Yet his decision required a different kind of courage. The instant he stepped beyond the boundaries of the honor farm, he understood that every day for the rest of his life would carry the possibility of capture. The Ohio Department of Corrections immediately launched a search. Officers checked nearby roads, questioned local residents, and distributed notices to surrounding law enforcement agencies. Because the honor farm lacked the extensive physical security of larger prisons, officials initially hoped the escapees would be found quickly. Similar walkaways often ended within days, as fugitives ran out of money, transportation, or places to hide. But Frank Freshwaters had no intention of surrendering. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, one uncomfortable realization became impossible to ignore. Frank Freshwaters had beaten the system. Frank Freshwaters understood that if he wanted to remain free, the man known as Frank Freshwaters had to disappear completely. He initially traveled south, eventually making his way to Florida. Like many fugitives of the era, he took advantage of a time when identity verification was far less sophisticated than it would become decades later. Under the alias William Harold Cox, Freshwaters quietly began building an entirely new life. Unlike many fugitives, he did not finance his freedom through robbery, fraud, or violence. Instead, he found honest work. Truck driving became his profession, allowing him to travel across long stretches of highway while avoiding unnecessary attention. The occupation suited someone determined to remain anonymous. Eventually, Freshwaters settled in West Virginia, where he worked for trucking companies. Co-workers came to know him as dependable, hardworking, and easy to get along with. Those around him had no reason to question his past, because nothing about his behavior suggested he was hiding anything extraordinary. By every outward appearance, Bill Cox was simply another American trying to earn a living. As the years passed, something remarkable happened. The escaped prisoner stopped living like a man on the run and began living like an ordinary citizen. He built friendships. He developed hobbies. He enjoyed playing guitar and listening to country music. Most importantly, he established a family life that few would have imagined possible for someone carrying an active prison escape warrant. Children and grandchildren came to know him not as Frank Freshwaters, but as Bill Cox, the man who worked hard, provided for those he loved, and rarely spoke about his past. The secret remained buried beneath decades of routine, and with each passing year, it became increasingly difficult to imagine that anyone would ever uncover the truth. Unlike many criminal investigations that eventually go cold or are closed entirely, prison escape cases are different. A sentence does not simply expire because someone successfully avoids capture. Every sunrise meant Frank Freshwaters still owed time to the state of Ohio. Every birthday marked another year he had escaped justice, and every decade only increased the remarkable nature of his disappearance. In 1975, authorities in Charleston, West Virginia, arrested the man they knew as William Harold Cox after discovering that he was, in fact, escaped inmate Frank Freshwaters. For officials in Ohio, it appeared the search was finally over. After 16 years as a fugitive, Freshwaters had been located alive and taken into custody. It seemed inevitable that he would soon be returned to Ohio to continue serving the sentence he had abandoned in 1959. But something extraordinary happened. By the time of his arrest, Freshwaters had become a respected member of his community. The people who knew him were stunned to learn that the quiet truck driver they had worked beside for years had once escaped from prison. Yet instead of turning against him, many spoke in his defense. They described him as hardworking, dependable, and honest in every aspect of his daily life. The case eventually reached the desk of West Virginia Governor Arch Moore Jr., whose decision would become one of the most remarkable moments in Freshwaters' long journey. Ohio requested that Freshwaters be extradited so he could complete the remainder of his sentence. Extradition between states is generally a routine legal process, particularly when dealing with an escaped prisoner. Yet Governor Moore looked beyond the paperwork and considered the life Freshwaters had lived since his escape. For 16 years, there had been no evidence that he had committed another violent crime. He had worked, paid taxes, supported his family, contributed to his community. According to reports from the time, Moore believed Freshwaters had demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. The governor reportedly described him as having lived a flawless life since arriving in West Virginia. Rather than approving Ohio's request, Moore refused to extradite him. It was an astonishing decision. Governor Moore's refusal to extradite him protected him only while he remained within West Virginia's jurisdiction. The moment circumstances changed, Ohio could renew its efforts. Knowing that, he made another critical decision. He disappeared once again. This time, he headed farther south, eventually settling in Florida, where he resumed life under the identity of William Harold Cox. There he would spend the next several decades quietly growing older, believing that perhaps time itself had become his greatest ally. Years turned into decades. New presidents entered and left the White House. The Berlin Wall fell, and the internet transformed the world. Meanwhile, the escaped inmate from 1959 continued living in near total obscurity. To the outside world, Frank Freshwaters had become little more than a forgotten name buried inside dusty prison records. But forgotten is not the same as forgiven. And in Ohio, a small group of investigators would eventually begin searching through those old files once again, looking for fugitives everyone else believed would never be found. One of those names immediately stood out: Frank Freshwaters. The hunt was about to begin all over again. By the early 2010s, arthritis had taken much of the strength from Freshwaters' body, and years of truck driving had left their mark on his health. He spent time with family, enjoyed country music, and occasionally played his guitar. If anyone had looked at the soft-spoken old man sitting on his porch, they would have seen someone enjoying a peaceful retirement after a lifetime of honest work. Around this time, the U.S. Marshal Service began revisiting old fugitive cases through specialized cold case initiatives. While many of these investigations focused on violent offenders, authorities also recognized that some of America's longest unsolved escape cases remained legally active. Among the aging files was one carrying the name Frank Freshwaters. Most investigators assumed they were looking for a man who was probably already dead. After all, more than 5 decades had passed since his escape. Even if he had survived, he would now be approaching 80 years old. Yet experienced investigators understand that assumptions solve very few cases. Instead of closing the file, they began reconstructing Freshwaters' life piece by piece. Eventually, those efforts led investigators to Melbourne, Florida. There, they identified a man named William Harold Cox, whose background seemed unusually difficult to verify. Quietly, investigators began comparing records and examining old photographs. The resemblance between Cox and the young inmate from Ohio was impossible to ignore, but suspicion alone was not enough. They needed undeniable proof. Rather than confronting him immediately, investigators developed a simple but effective strategy. Officers approached Freshwaters while posing as representatives handling insurance paperwork. The request appeared completely routine. They simply needed a few signatures to finalize documents. As he complied, they obtained fingerprints without raising suspicion. Those fingerprints were sent for comparison against records taken nearly 6 decades earlier. The match was conclusive. The elderly retiree living quietly in Florida was not William Harold Cox. He was Frank Freshwaters. 56 years after escaping from an Ohio prison farm, one of America's longest-running fugitive cases had finally come to an end. On May 4, 2015, deputies returned to Freshwaters' mobile home to make the arrest. There was no dramatic pursuit through back roads or desperate attempt to flee.
And they confronted him with the evidence that they had, and he said, "You're right, it's me. I am Frank Freshwater."
The man they encountered was no longer the 23-year-old fugitive. Standing before them was a 79-year-old grandfather suffering from severe arthritis and other age-related health problems. According to reports, investigators showed him one of his original photographs from the late 1950s. Freshwaters reportedly smiled and remarked that he had not seen that picture in a very long time. For 56 years, he had successfully stayed ahead of the law. Yet when that journey finally ended, there was no anger, no resistance, and no attempt to deny who he was. News outlets across America immediately seized on one detail above all others. The man they were calling the Shawshank Fugitive had once been imprisoned inside the very building later used to portray Shawshank State Penitentiary in the beloved 1994 film. The nickname reflected the shared location rather than any direct inspiration. Nevertheless, the comparison fascinated audiences. The prison that millions associated with Andy Dufresne's fictional escape had also housed a real inmate who successfully disappeared for more than half a century. Freshwaters was extradited back to Ohio to continue serving the sentence interrupted in 1959. Yet the circumstances had changed dramatically. Prison officials were no longer dealing with a young escapee capable of disappearing again. They were responsible for an elderly man whose health had significantly declined. By this point, he had lived more years as a free citizen than he ever would have spent in prison had he simply completed his original sentence. The case soon reached the Ohio Parole Board. Members of the board faced a difficult decision. On one hand, Freshwaters had undeniably escaped lawful custody and avoided serving his sentence for decades. On the other hand, the evidence showed that during those same decades, he had maintained steady employment, raised a family, avoided additional serious criminal conduct, and expressed remorse for the death of Eugene Flint. In February 2016, the parole board voted to grant his release. Their decision did not erase the tragedy of 1957, nor did it suggest that escaping prison had been justified. Instead, it reflected the belief that the goals of the criminal justice system include not only punishment, but also rehabilitation. After weighing his advanced age, his conduct during more than 5 decades as a fugitive, and the practical realities of continuing his incarceration, Ohio concluded that mercy served a greater purpose than further imprisonment. For Frank Freshwaters, it marked the final chapter of a story that had begun nearly 60 years earlier with one reckless decision behind the wheel of a car. In the end, Frank Freshwaters' greatest connection to the Shawshank Redemption is not that he escaped from the same prison. It is that both stories remind us how powerful and how complicated the human desire for freedom can be. One became one of the greatest works of fiction ever brought to the screen. The other became one of the most extraordinary true stories ever to emerge from behind the walls of the prison that the world would forever know as Shawshank. Thanks for watching. If someone spends 56 years proving they've changed, does that erase the crime they committed, or should justice always catch up, no matter how much time has passed? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more awesome videos from... Hey, you want to watch a movie? Shh.